Well, move on to our last speaker, who is a kind of cherry on the top of the cake. So, as PWL scholars, we are all convinced that the work Michael shares, and he clearly doesn't need any kind of introduction, but I'm always pleased to do it. So I will say a couple of words about him. He's a researcher at the CNRS Center Jean Pipin in Paris and a visiting scholar at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. He was trained as a classical scholar, and he has published widely in the history of Greek, Latin, and Islamic philosophy and their relations to contemporary science. As a student of Pierre Hadot, he has translated 6 of Hadot's books into English. Most recently, Don't Forget to Read, Goethe and Traditional Spiritual Exercises, which is right there on the table, and was also co-editor of Philosophy as a Way of Life, Ancients and Moderns, essays in honor of Pierre Hadot. With Matthew Sharp and Eli Kramer, he is co-founder and co-director of the previous series Philosophy as a Way of Life, Texts and Studies. And in addition to numerous online presentations, he has been invited to teach or lecture on PWL as a visiting professor in Mexico, Brazil, Japan, and Italy, among others. Today, he's going to talk about philosophy as a way of life and contemplative studies.
Oh, it's on there. Not sure that we're on now.
It's on, but oh, it's off now. Yeah, it's
Okay, good. Thank you so much, Marta. And I take this opportunity to thank both Marta as Pedro for the organization of this wonderful conference, one of the best organized and most rich that I think I've ever attended. Thanks to all of you who have stuck it out this long and listened to me. I know that it's been such a rich banquet that the main desire that most of us have after such a banquet is to go and have a mix now. Thank you for helping it out. So I'm going to talk about PWL and contemplative studies. What do I mean by contemplative studies?
right. Yeah.
Basically, contemplative studies is the discipline that deals, like the philosophy of the way of life is a relatively new discipline, and it deals with all aspects of meditation. But in specific, in the form that I'm going to be discussing here, it deals with scientific measurements by various procedures of the activity in the brain and human nervous system of what goes on during meditation, basically.
I'm sorry, could you bring the microphone closer to you? They're saying that it's not very clear.
Okay.
Please, you have to ask that. So talk to
Okay, okay. Everyone can hear me? I will assume so unless I go done.
Oh, yeah, the person that said it wasn't very good, it's success.
Okay, great. So this study is resolutely interdisciplinary, and while it concentrates on fields such as Buddhism, Hinduism, of which meditation is a constitutive part, it can be extended to other fields such as Greco-Roman philosophy, Buddhism, Christianity, and some aspects of Islamic thought. Here we're going over some territory that I can go quickly here because we don't know this. Know that for Plato, what is essential in ancient philosophy was the notion of spiritual exercises, SEs from now on, set of practical techniques for various goals, ameliorating suboptimal personality traits, providing consolation, practical advice, everyday problem life, and finally achieving cosmic consciousness, which will basically, I'm going to define that for take for granted the definition of cosmic consciousness here as the feeling that we are a part of the cosmos. It's held, that the assiduous practice of these exercises can have a lasting transformative effect on us. To the extent that by shifting our perspective, we can transform ourselves from our usual default state of relative unhappiness to a state of which I will describe as more happy, autonomous, and free, and even intense. Well, that goes so far as to say that we can increase the degree to which we exist by in spiritual exercise. So, what is left to do here? Well, basically, what I want to ask here is how do spiritualizers work as they do, or some of the time? What parts of the human nervous system and body are affected by these practices, and in what way? And what possible effects might they have on our psychological health and well-being? Now, since there have been, to my knowledge, no experimental studies of the effects of spiritual exercises, I think the best we can do is to point out some parallels between certain spiritual exercises and certain contemplative practices, which for their part have been studied, thanks to contemplative studies, of extensive neurophysiological research. CS, contemplative studies, has made considerable practice discovering the brain regions, pathways, etc. Brain regions which are active in the state of meditation. So my working hypothesis in this presentation is that, with all due caution, we can extrapolate from these findings of contemplative studies carried out primarily on mindfulness meditation to some spiritual exercises, and therefore hypothesize what the neurophysiological mechanisms and potential health benefits of ST.
I'm sorry, they are still saying that it's still bubbly. I think it's sometimes so I'm looking this way and then this way. So probably trying to place it right around the view. Hope it's
All right, we'll try that.
thank you.
Fair enough. So I'm going to be concentrating, as I said, on mindfulness. Mindfulness is used to designate a tendency to become popular in the West over the last 50 years. John Kabat-Zinn, one of its founders, defines it as paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. And it's mainly about how we learning to allocate our attention most effectively. Its main method is to attempt to quiet our usual dispersed and self-centered thoughts by concentrating on the rhythm of our own breathing. Meanwhile, all discursive thoughts, all distractions, as well as all sometimes unpleasant emotions, are to be duly acknowledged and identified as they come to distract us from our meditation, and then quietly and patiently dismissed. Of course, this is breath control and observation is not the only mindfulness exercise. There are others. Benji spoke about metta, loving kindness, body scan. There are others. We'll be concentrating here on surveillance of the breath. The goal of the process of mindfulness meditation is basically to achieve a state of wakeful alertness. This entails something that's been called the relaxation response, in which heart rate, breathing rate, etc. slow down. And it's been discovered that this can lead, when practiced repeatedly over time, this can lead to long-term lower rates of blood pressure and of cortisol, the hormone that's released under stressful situations, and which tends to suppress the effects of the immune system on other things. Another goal of mindfulness is, through this management of attention that we've talked about, to obtain knowledge of how things are with us, our sensations, feelings, states of mind, body in general, here and now, but without, as I mentioned, adding to this awareness any judgment, whether negative or positive, and above all, without identifying with our thoughts, feelings, and emotions. In the metaphor that's frequently used by mindfulness instructors, we are to imagine ourselves as sitting on a riverbank and watching a river going by, taking with it various flotsam and jetsam of leaves and branches. Those are our thoughts and ideas. We can observe them, but they're not us. We're still sitting there on the bank. Sure. Other goals, to become aware of the objective nature of the way things are, as they are, the world here and now. So that, and here the underlying idea is something mindfulness shares with the moment as means the famous idea that it's not so much the way things are in themselves as the way they affect us, that make us suffer. But pieces, and you chapter number 5, the things. So that even if we can't always change the objective state of the world, it is always within our power, to some extent at least, to control our reaction to the state of the world. In contemporary psychological terminology, we could say that the Buddhist goal is to make ourselves less reactive. That is to say, no longer passively allow things and events to affect us randomly, but to choose and decide what affects us and how. A lot of health benefits have been claimed for mindfulness. Some of these are controversial. I won't have time to look at that here, but here are some of the areas in which these claims have been made. Mindfulness has been claimed to be effective in reducing chronic pain and alleviating insomnia, addictive behaviors such as alcohol and drug abuse, eating disorders. It does have beneficial effects on anxiety and depression. We saw it help to reduce stress, lower levels of cortisol, blood pressure, and finally, it's been helped to improve interoception. Say our awareness of and attentiveness to bodily sensations, and this in turn, this improved interoception has been discovered to correlate with improved will. Now, in a very well-known mindfulness study from 2006, Bear et al. Identified 5 main elements of mindfulness. And I'm going to maintain that all of these have parallels with each other. These include non-reactivity in our experience, observing, noting, or attending the sensation, perception, thoughts, and feelings, acting with awareness, not on automatic pilot, concentration on non-distraction, all of those considered more or less synonymous, describing and labeling words, and being non-judgmental of experience. Number 1, I'm going to argue that non-reactivity in our experience corresponds more or less to the SE of passionlessness, pathia. Now, we know that this was one of the goals of spiritual exercises. It was sought to be acquired by means of self-mastery and gratia, indifference to different things, the therapy of the passions. Was important in Stoicism, Philo of Alexandria, Porphyry, Church Fathers, and so forth. Dorotheus, for example, Dorotheus of Gaza, one of the Desert Fathers, advises that remarks that the spiritual seeker finds himself doing as he wills all the time, for he does not want things to be as he wills them, but he wills them that they be just what they are. Although it's shown that this is an adaptation of a part of a saying from the Manual of Epictetus. And in the mindfulness tradition, there's a popular anecdote about the traveler and the shepherd. The traveler asks the shepherd, so what kind of weather are we going to have today? And the shepherd requires, well, it's the kind of weather I like. How do you know that's the going to be the kind of weather you like today? Ask the traveler. The shepherd says, well, having found out that I can't always get the weather I like, I have learned to always like what I get. So I'm quite sure we will have the kind of weather I like. As far as observing and noticing, attending to sensations, perceptions, thoughts, and feelings are concerned, this may correspond to this the SE of examination of the conscience. So the key element, once again, in ancient thought, Dialecto has shown, Pythagoreans, Epicureans, Stoics, Plutarch, Christian tradition. It entails frequent examinations of one's thoughts and intentions, always remaining on the outlook for signs of spiritual backsliding. It entails such more concrete practices as recording one's emotions and intellectual reactions throughout the day, keeping desire, etc., as in the case of Marcus Aurelius. Examination of the conscience Epictetus once again cites the example of the Pythagorean golden verses. Do not welcome sleep into your languid eyes before you have gone 3 times through your deeds, each of your days that way. That day, where did I go astray? What did I accomplish? What duty did I neglect? Now, in neurophysiology, this corresponds, as I mentioned, to interoception, the awareness of intentions, bodily sensations, correlating apparently with activity in the insula, and the ability to skillfully recruit neuroceptive attention may disrupt automatic conceptual elaboration, aka automaticity and mind wandering. Come back to these 2 factors later. Number 3, acting with awareness, automatic pilot, concentration on distraction can be held to correspond more or less to the SE of attention processing. And this is the constitutive SE of Stoicism, as Plato has shown, represents continuous vigilance and awareness, allowing philosophy to be aware of what she is doing at every moment. It entails concentration on the present moment. It entails the presence of God into oneself, and this is brought about by constant meditation of the rules of life, the canonies. This attention to present quality, seen a few times during this conference, at the expense of the concentrating on the worries about the future, regrets about the past, which no longer depend on us, can enable us to exceed the cosmic consciousness. As I said, this means I'm understanding by that, feeling that we are an integral part of the cosmos. And it does this by enabling us to concentrate on the infinite value of every instant, enabling us to switch perspectives. Here, modern psychologists speak of cognitive flexibility, and view each situation not from the viewpoint of our individual ego-centered interest, but from the perspective of the universal law of the cosmos. Here, I think that there's an analogy with what contemporary psychologists speak of as embodied self-processing, characterized by a sense of relatedness to the world, decreasing the boundaries between the self and the world. Describing or labeling one's experience could be said to correspond to the Stoic SE of physical definition. And this, as Marcus Aurelius says, corresponds to breaking down when we are confronted by a frightening or a pleasant phenomenon. The solution is that you break it down into its elemental parts. Perhaps we are scared when we consider a threatening phenomenon in its ensemble, but if we break it down into individual parts, we can manage individual parts all by themselves. So we're supposed to make, according to this SE, we're supposed to make a description of the object that's presented to us, so as to see it in itself. We are to say to ourselves the name of each of its parts. And as Hadlo says, we can call this kind of definition physical, but it frees our representations from every kind of subjective and anthropomorphic consideration, as well as from every relation to human. In other words, here, this is a recurrent theme, the goal is objectivity. From a cognitive perspective, labeling reinforces our ability to concentrate on the future moment by activating the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex and to reduce responses in the amygdala through the activation of the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, thus enabling a detached awareness of our present. Finally, being non-judgmental experience is yet another aspect of this quest for objectivity that underlies SEs. The Stoic thought, as part of Marcus Aurelius' triple discipline, implies refraining from knee-jerk automatic responses in order to obtain an objective representation of the way things really are, apart from the subjective value which they usually wrap them up. We usually tend to follow our first reactions to things. We tend to evaluate things with regard to their relevance to us and to evaluate them as beautiful, ugly, scary, reassuring, etc. Without stopping to think of how we are to resituate the phenomenon in question within the context of the role that it plays the overall workings of the cosmos. As far as from a neurophysiological perspective, this can be called non-evaluative perception, and it's thought to depend on reduced communication between the occipital and the lateral parietal cortices of the brain, which are responsible for low-level early sensory processing and for higher-level top-down regulatory processing, respectively. And interesting recent studies have shown that this state, which is promoted by concentrated meditation, may allow the brain to entertain interpretation of sensory stimuli for longer periods without feeling the need to decide between the corresponding attitude of openness alternatives. Now, Marcus Aurelius writes that by becoming familiarized with nature by practicing physics as a spiritual exercise, we can look at the world and see what's happening in it objectively. Marcus Aurelius famously writes that the person who has become familiarized with nature will derive no less pleasure from contemplating the actual gaping jaws of wild beasts than he does from all the imitations made of them by painters and sculptors. Only that person who has become truly familiar with nature and their works will be able to do this. So when we consider what we experience, no longer with regard to our individual interests, but with regard to the role within the grand scheme of things, phenomena like the tusks of the rushing wild boar will be seen as just as aesthetically pleasing as an artistic representation of a boar on the attack. So this shift of perspective that is intended to be facilitated by SDs amounts to the realization that the world does not revolve around us, around our individual selves. When this happens, we can adopt this interesting, decentered perspective that lets us see once again some degree of cognitive consciousness. And this process can be referred to as decentered. And here the French writer Jacques S. wrote a very interesting book on cosmic consciousness in 2003. Speaks of a strategy of self-decentering as a way to die to oneself, as a little death in to one's narrative, personal identity. And his whole book is based on the leitmotif of the example of the Australian ecofeminist Val Plumwood, was on expedition in Australia, solo canoeing, and all of a sudden a crocodile took over her canoe, grabbed her leg, and started dragging her underwater. So she was certain that she was going to die. She did not, unfortunately, but she later on reported that during this experience, she experienced the world outside the great self-centered narrative within which all sentences begin with I. Here, according to Hess's explanation, Plumwood's abstract theoretical knowledge about food chains and ecology suddenly became quite concrete. Now, she was part of a food chain and not in a particularly advantageous position. And Hess interprets this experience as the substitution of a first person or a third person ecology, which abstract knowledge becomes a lived knowledge in the world as perceived, quote, without the business of activity. So, although Plumwood doesn't seem Marcus Aurelius advised to have derived extended pleasure from the fact that the crocodile was biting on her leg and dragging her to her death, he does at least seem to have been able to shift to shall I say, to integrate and make a part, to assimilate and make part of herself this previously abstract knowledge. And that is one of the goals, one of the many goals of spiritual exercise over the auto. Now, as far as from a psychological neuroscientific perspective, centering which is also known as reperceiving cognitive insight or cognitive fusion, has been described as the mode of awareness arising when feelings, thoughts, or emotions are perceived to be changeable and fleeting, so that we can observe them arise and dissolve without having to act on them. It's the ability to step back from our experience, perceive it in a less self-focused way. And it's what allows us to do what mindfulness advises us to do, that is to say, to avoid identifying with our thoughts and our emotions, perceiving them as leaves being carried away down a river, or as scenes being depicted on a movie screen, which we are not a part of. Now, another way to understand decentering is the reduction of self-referential thinking. And egocentric thought is difficult because pretty well our pre-reflective default state, according to which the world revolves around us, and we are then to evaluate things, as we mentioned, as a function of its benefit or disadvantage to what we is called equal self. That collection of memories, hopes, desires, and fears that are all centered around ourselves as a central factor on this state. Pablo asks us to reconsider our unthinking identification with this piccolo self, so that we may become aware of our potential identity, but a deeper, broader, more objective and universal self that is, in a sense, more us than we are. And this higher self, Pablo compares to the diamond of Marcus Aurelius, Plotinus, is both immanent and transcendent, both a part of us and something beyond us. And I would argue that it's that better self, that better version of ourselves, with which thinkers from Kierkegaard and Nietzsche invite us to identify when they urge us to become who we are. Now, this the piccolo self, default normal self, is associated physiologically with what's been known as the default mode network. So the self-centered thought processes that constitute the piccolo self corresponds with this network of brain regions that remain metabolically active even when the rest of the body is at rest. It's the locus of what the Greeks call dianoia, or discursive thought. And this, so this DMN is also associated with mind wandering, rumination, and brooding, some forms of which have been found to be uncomfortable of problems. Reduced ability to practice decentering therefore correlates with increased anxiety, depression, whereas diminution of egocentric rumination by decentering is associated with positive effects, many of which correspond to key features of the inner transformations that are claimed by SEs. And these include the alleviation of anxiety and depression, acceptance of one's current situation, lack of reactivity to pleasant experiences, reappraisal, or the ability to adopt a different perspective to one's current situation. There is basically the same thing as cognitive flexibility. An increased sense of relatedness to the world corresponding to heteronormative sense of consciousness, improved pro-social feelings, and lessening of bias against outsiders, which can therefore contribute to the aspect of Marcus Aurelius' discipline, which corresponds to ethics, which we add and to a stronger emphasis on experience in the now, corresponding to those emphasis on exercise, the SE of concentration on the present. So, where should we go from here? Well, here are some suggestions for some possible future sort of orientation. As I said at the outset, it would be desirable, ideally, to establish some collaboration with neuroscientists and cognitive scientists in order to design and carry out experiments on the neurophysiological correlates of the spiritual exercise. Or specifically, one could imagine a comparison of the SE, the view from above, that intended to relativize our problems by means of an imaginative shift of perspective from our own individual misfortunes to a broader view of the world. And recent work in psychology tending to show that a global perspective tends to make people more happy than a local perspective. We could also imagine a comparison between those emphasis on self-transformation and transcendence, goal of ancient philosophy, and recent work in psychology tending to, and current studies on self-transcendence in contemplative studies and related disciplines. One example of this would be S-art, paradigm of meditation, which stands for self-awareness, self-regulation, and self-transcendence. Next, in contemplative studies, self-transcendence is also often linked to feelings of oneness with or connected with nature's connectedness to nature. And this is relevant to the relation that we've seen from Pablo Grandelli's presentation on the relation between Pierre studies of self-transformative SEs and his work on the history of the concept of nature as in the veil of Isis and contemporary ecology. And finally, some aspects of CS may complement or correct some aspects of Plato's conception of PWL. For example, the tendency towards mind-body dualism, particularly in Platonism, and the consequent tendency of most SEs to neglect the importance of the body. Contemplative approaches such as the interacting subsystems approach, ICS, based on the embodied cognition paradigm, may supplement this subject of PWL. Now, how much time have I got left?
Sorry. I think 2 minutes, 2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay, well, I won't go any further into the contemplative study of active interest. Inference paradigm is except to mention that it's a paradigm in cognitive studies that understands the mind as a prediction machine. The goal of which is to diminish surprises. And the cognitive scientist Giuseppe Pagnoni has brought this into relation with meditation. And his take-home message basically is that meditation from this view can allow us to transform rumination, self-centered meditation, self-centered obsession, from an impediment to something that is beneficial to health. For example, if we are an inveterate smoker, we refrain under the influence of meditative instruction. From satisfying that urge, then we can watch as that urge arises, peaks, and gradually goes away. We can thereby become aware of our non-conscious urges and their causes. We also mentions that, and that's the sense in which, for Bagnoni, meditative constraints, the rules that we have when we enter meditation can have an auto-epistemic value. They can contribute to our self-knowledge, and they can also diminish the effect of non-reflective epistemic behavior. And he also mentions that it can, that meditation can contribute to realizing the limits of our own epistemic power. This is a theme of epistemic modesty, which I argue is a tendency throughout history of Greek thought and moving on to Islamic thought and on even to modern sciences like quantum mechanics, which leads to this tendency of epistemic modesty. So, conclusion. Pagnoni also adds that this meditation can also involve getting touch with and accepting the intrinsic limitations of our epistemic powers. Further studies on the interface between these two massive disciplines of CS and PWL may therefore shed new light on philosophical methods of self-transformation, which a scientific studies have suggested may be capable of improving our mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being. They may also solidify these the link between both these disciplines and its modesty. That generalized outlook on life and the world, which emphasizes humility, both with regard to our own cognitive capacity and to our interaction with the natural world. And it's my hope that such studies may contribute to all three areas that would make up what Aristotle called the triple discipline. Logic conceived as a careful scrutiny of our thoughts and of feelings with a view to ensuring their objectivity. To ethics as the study of how to promote pro-social behavior, and to physics as the study of the most appropriate attitude to adopt in our interaction with nature. So this multidisciplinary approach may thus be the one promising avenue for dealing with the current pending crises of the critically troubled period.
so much. It's a fascinating field, and it's great to end the conference with an opening of a door or a window for further research. I think it's looking forward to this. So, questions? Eli, then John, then Kevin.
Thanks, Mike, and I agree. It's like a really wonderful way to end the conference. I was curious about what you found most striking, if anything, about what's proven ineffective in mindfulness practice. Do you think that there's lessons for us that help think through philosophy as a way of life? In particular, it doesn't mean the practices themselves, sometimes it has to do with context. In particular, I'm thinking this group of studies that comes out that mindfulness, as they've tried to implement it in schools in the UK, turns out to have some difficulties about actually, increasing things. So if there's things like that, that's given any takeaway home messages for you as you're thinking through all of this and sort of initially exploring it.
Well, I guess it's like everything else. If you have something that's been studied in thousands of scientific studies, you're going to get some that return negative results and others that return positive. So there are dangers which are not unlike those that are faced by the contemporary Stoicism. Mindfulness is, after all, a secularized Western version of Vipassana meditation. And as such, it's a simplification and an adaptation. And as such, it may be argued to be distorted. For instance, I mentioned, I think, in one of my comments, that whereas loving kindness meditation, metta, translated as friendliness, plays a very specific role in Buddhist meditation. It's been sort of travestied in some mindfulness settings to a point where it amounts to sort of a self-satisfaction and the feeling that, oh, I'm good enough just the way I am, I don't have to change anything. Wonderful, which I think is the form of narcissism. So yeah, and of course there are good systems involved in what's been called mindfulness. Just as sometimes in modern Stoicism has been called rulism. But the fact that a phenomenon can be abused and done badly doesn't mean that it's useless.
But do you think in some way we should use that as a feedback loop with caution and sort of reflection, from the, yeah.
Absolutely. You apply the caution.
Marta, please see the chat. There's probably something there.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I apologise because I've mentioned this at least once today already, but in Stoic Week, we are effectively testing Hadouian spiritual exercises, amongst other things, because when we first put it together over a decade ago, it's like, okay, what the hell are we going to ask people to do apart from think stoically? And so it was to Hadou that we turned in order to look for practices and things that people could actually do. So that's part of what's in effect being tested there. And this year, at my institution, we have a couple of doctoral students in clinical psychology who are running a proper trial effectively based on Stoic ideas and Hadouian spiritual exercises, which will hopefully produce some publishable data. So that would be another example of these sorts of practices being tested to sit alongside. It's not going to involve the neuroscience element, but it will hopefully produce some peer-reviewed results. So that might be an interesting complement to the
Yeah. And I don't want to give the impression, but I don't think I'm engaged in your introduction, so I don't want to say that what goes on in the mind in the course of either meditation or spirituality can be excused with what goes on in the brain. What goes on in the brain correlates with our inner experience. Can be used with caution as evidence of what goes on in the brain, but it's not foolproof evidence. It's sort of an additional confirmation of the efficacy, and it's part of, from a more autobiographical perspective, it's part of my general liking for trying to see points of contact between ancient philosophy and contemporary science in an effort to reduce the abyss between the hard sciences and the so-called soft sciences, which I think is really very deleterious.
Thank you very much, Professor Chase, for this original and very instigating talk. So I've been thinking about the views of Isis since this morning because of Pablo Lamberti's talk, and I could not help but to wonder how this alliance between contemplative studies and philosophy as a way of life, in a sense, would represent a kind of reconciliation between a Promethean attitude towards nature and an Orphic attitude towards nature. So, Terne and Theoria. So, technology, because neurophysiology, neuroscience, the most modern technical devices to map brain regions and track neuropaths, but for the purpose of theory of contemplation, is more meditation, mindfulness. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about this reconciliation between a Promethean and a Orphic attitude towards nature.
I think that's an important point, that, yeah, we, once again, any kind of something, any kind of activity and collaboration that reduces the gap between humanities and the hard sciences is welcome. As long as without that necessarily entailing the subordination of one to the other. For instance, if we study meditative experience or experiences of unity with the divine, and we do, like the neurophysiologist and Zen practitioner James Austin, we try to figure out what goes on in the brain at that time. Well, we can study that, but that doesn't, I don't think that need have any implications to the reality of that phenomenon. We can both, it could be the case that there is a reality out there that we're responding to. Perhaps we're seeing the world as it really is. And that's a separate question from what goes on in our brains. Don't think it prejudices. Concentration on what goes on in the brain at the same time does not prejudice the separate question of the reality, of whether there's something out there in reality that corresponds to these. It's a separate question. That should be answered by theologians and philosophers in that decision.
Have a last question online by David.
Hello there. In your answers, oh, sorry, I started out in cognitive neuropsychology many years ago, but I shifted to the importance of environments. And in your answers, I found I've got a better picture of what you think. Where I was slightly worried was, which appeared to be the reductive problem that goes on in the management of neuropsychological states, which obviously can be pharmacological. And we've got then the problem of quietism. And so that was just, I think you answered it with the questions that you're not emphasizing that, but I think that needs to be made clear, especially with embodied cognition and in activism rather than some models. My kind of interest was with Austin and the amygdala, whereas earlier on the top down was controlling the amygdala. So I think that's a really important comment that you could do more with about how spiritual exercises may be impacting what you could call those quieter voices, I think you said with Austin. But where I was interested was to do with the accusation of quietism and escape into mystical states when you've got the world around you disintegrating. How do we address that? That's my own importance of sometimes the climate is changing and the weather's telling you sometimes to run. And, you know, there are real difficulties with assessing that as a community. I mean, a lot of things that I'm bringing forward, but it's the community that is sometimes more valuable than the practice. Having said that, we have a Centre for Mindfulness here for 30 years, and I'm part of that. Then all my worries where I feel PWL could add more about disturbance and communities to the very contemplative practices. I hope that's clear enough, Michael, but it's a disturbance that I've had all my life, starting off in neurophysiology, as it were.
Well, of course, it's an old problem. For a long time, the entire Hellenistic age was sort of dismissed as a reaction to the age of what God's called the age of anxiety. Yeah. This withdrawal into the citadel of the self was considered as some kind of a cowardly and irresponsible retreat into the self. But it's something on one part, but we have every reason to believe almost every culture in the history of the world has experiences of unity with some greater whole, and I don't see any reason we have it in our culture. It's been associated with religion, sometimes not. Michel Poulain has shown in the study about what he calls mysticism sauvage.
Sorry, can't quite hear you. You're not very clear. Sorry.
Not very clear, I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're clear what you're saying. It's just the audio. It's sorry, it's on. Yeah.
This mentioned studies of Michel Poulain on what he calls the mysticism sauvage, where he studies a wide variety of mystical experiences for people who didn't necessarily have any religious orientation. So there seems to be something that corresponds to quote unquote the mystical experience of almost all times and cultures. Now, is that just a psychological illusion, or is it another way of perceiving reality, which, for all we know, might be, in a sense, as real as the world that we perceive in everyday sense? So, should we abandon these studies and concentrate on the world's problems, or should we remind Hadot's should we remind ourselves of Hadot's reminder that there are an awful lot of people who call for the revolution, but there are very few people who work on making themselves worthy of it. As to say, improving themselves, transforming themselves, so as to be capable of and worthy of the necessary social changes that we have.
It's now time to close the session, not before thanking again Michael Chase for the